I'm going to be talking today about atomic force microscopy and the use of it for studying nanomaterials properties. So we have an AFM. The AFM essentially consists of a probe tip that's situated at the end of a cantilever that's used to raster across the surface. Due to force interaction between the tip and the surface features, such as the surface morphology, we'll have deflections of the tip as it's rastering along the surface. So you can see here that we have our cantilever mounted on the tip holder that will mount on our stage in just a moment. The cantilever was chosen to have a high spring constant of about 220 newtons per meter. This is in order to be able to indent with the appropriate force to measure harder samples that we're interested in. So what I'm going to do now is flip this over and place it onto our probe head. This probe head has a laser alignment system. Okay, so you can see that at the end of this probe head, you see a laser spot. We'll focus and align that laser spot on the very end of that cantilever in just a moment. And we're ready to perform experimentation. AFM is also useful because we can use it in a more stationary mode in order to perform nanomechanical testing at the surface. What this consists of is essentially driving the probe tip into the sample surface, measuring the forces that that tip makes as it's indenting with some known driving force. And from that we can calculate materials properties such as the hardness of the material and the stiffness or elastic modulus of that material. These properties are useful at the nanometer scale because nanometer properties tend to differ from bulk properties of materials. So it's important for nanoscale research to understand what those nanomaterial properties are. So we're now in alignment position, and I'm going to move over and control the scan head from computer. I'm going to be moving the laser alignment to the very end of this tip on a reflector, as you can see in the image on the computer screen here. So now I'm going to be adjusting the focus of the laser and spatial alignment using control knobs on this probe head. I'm just trying to maximize laser signal intensity. Through coarse and fine adjustments. All right, so now that I've adjusted the laser, what I'm looking at here is the signal response on the detector that's monitoring reflections off of a reflector on the back of this cantilever. So I've got this signal to its maximum, and I've also centered the signal in the detector quadrant. So our next course of action is to characterize the tip. We need a well-characterized tip in order to gain useful information about the forces that are associated with the nanoindentation. In order to calculate the force associated with each indentation, we need to know what the spring constant of the cantilever is, and we need to know what the penetration depth of the tip into our sample of interest is. The spring constant of the cantilever is either given by manufacturer or can be validated through a straightforward approach. In order to calculate the penetration depth of the tip into the sample surface itself, though, we need to know something about what the response of the optical feedback system is for the instrument in the condition in which it's being used. And so what I'll demonstrate now is how we calculate deflection sensitivity that measures the bending response of the cantilever in response to pressure when it touches a surface. So we're now at our sample surface, and we need to engage on that surface. So what I'm going to do is move to a spot on the edge of the sample. Now I'm going to slowly bring the tip down toward the sample surface in order to just barely make contact with the surface. The sample that's on the stage right now is a sapphire standard. Sapphire is a very hard material. We need a hard material in order to calibrate this deflection sensitivity for this system, because a hard material will not let this tip penetrate through the surface to a significant extent. If you don't have sapphire, you can use something like silicon as an alternative. So now I've got the tip very close to the sample surface. I'm going to be using the video camera on the computer monitor in order to visualize where the sample comes into focus. Now we can start to see the edge clarifying. And now our sample is in focus. And so we see our sapphire sample here and the stage underneath it just below. I'm now going to move to a relatively clean and debris-free spot on the sample surface. I'm going to use the computer controls to do that. Now it's important to both have a clean spot on the surface and to have something that is suitably hard, such as sapphire or silicon, because we want to be able to decouple the bending motion of the cantilever from the actual indentation when we perform the nanomechanical experiment. I found a relatively clean spot on the sapphire surface. I'm now going to engage at that location, which will bring the tip down into contact with the surface. The tip is now in contact with the surface, and what I need to do is to measure the deflection response as a function of force. And so we'll move to the ramp feature of this instrument, which allows us to do just that and obtain a force curve for I'm going to collect a single ramp. This is a typical force curve where we see a signal response in the area of contact. And in this area, we want to calculate the deflection sensitivity. So I'll focus on an area that contains only this linear response. And calculate the slope. It's important to make note of the deflection sensitivity because we'll use it in future calculations. It's also important that any time that the probe is changed or the AFM is altered in any significant way, that this deflection sensitivity be recalibrated. All that one needs to do is use the same hard materials such as sapphire or silicon and repeat these same experiments. In this case, we have a deflection sensitivity of 199 nanometers per volt. So I'm going to save that to the computer. It's also a good idea to write that number down. Now we can move on to indenting a sample of interest. We've used a standard gold sample in order to assess the accuracy with which this method detects the elastic properties of a material. For this sample, we've run an array of 3 rows of indents with 15 indents per row. As we go from right to left across a row, we see that the size of these indents increases. This corresponds to an increase in force of each indent across the row. That's repeated twice over so that we have statistical representation. We increase the force by increasing the trigger threshold that is used to control the degree by which the cantilever impacts the surface. That trigger threshold can be multiplied by the deflection sensitivity that we calculated earlier in order to determine that penetration depth. In the equation F equals Kx, we now have a relationship between the spring constant and the force that was applied, and so we can calculate the applied force for each indent. For each of these indents, we've collected force curves. These force curves contain information about both the approaching tip and the tip as it retracts from the surface. What we're interested in for the purposes of calculating nanomechanical characteristics is that approaching force curve, because we want to eliminate to the extent possible adhesion forces that may arise that complicate some of the physics associated with this particular experiment. So what we'll need to do is use our deflection sensitivity, spring constant, and other information about the tip character that should be supplied by tip manufacturer in order to calculate the Young's modulus, or degree of stiffness of the material of interest. For gold in particular, the Young's modulus is about 78 gigapascal. So we're going to see if our measurements are somewhat similar in order to verify and validate our methods. So what I have here is that approaching force curve shown in blue on this plot. And I'm going to fit it with a model that takes into account the shape of our tip. Our tip is a conically shaped tip, and so we'll use the Sneddon model in order to calculate the Young's modulus for this particular series of indentations. I'm going to be moving to the Sneddon model. When we fit this data with our Sneddon model, we obtain a value of 76 gigapascal for gold nanoindentation. This is very close to our expected value of about 78 gigapascal, which validates that this method is appropriate for performing indentations at a gold surface. The determination of nanomechanical properties by AFM is useful for us in our nanofocus area at Erdc because it allows us to assess the characteristics associated with a wide range of films. The technique is particularly applicable to softer materials such as biological films and cells, but we've also demonstrated its use on soft metals. We've looked today at gold in particular, and can apply the technique to a whole host of materials that we're interested in, from cells, biological samples, to more complicated systems such as hybrid or composite materials.